The wind carried a strange kind of quiet that morning, one that made the cottonwoods along the creek whisper secrets to each other. The town of Silver Fern sat small and proud against the sunburnt plains of northern Arizona, its few wooden buildings standing like old men too stubborn to sit down. A church, a saloon, a general store, and a handful of homes with sagging porches, that was about all. Folks said it wasn't much of a town, but it was home to those who didn't know where else to belong. It was a hard place, this patch of dust and hope. The men were mostly ranch hands or drifters, the kind who came with the wind and left when it shifted. The women, strong as the red clay they tilled, had learned to keep their backs straight and their hearts guarded. Yet for all their strength, there was one thing that had become almost a law among them. A woman couldn't make it alone. The phrase had been whispered so many times it had sunk into the bones of the town. We can't live without a man. You could hear it in the way the women spoke over the washtubs, in the way the widows bowed their heads when the preacher talked about family. It wasn't that they didn't work hard enough or think sharp enough. It was that life out here was cruel, and the land didn't care for pride. A ranch needed hands, fences needed mending, and nights could stretch cold and lonesome without someone to split the silence. But all that began to change the day she arrived. She came on horseback, a tall sorrel mare that looked too fine for this part of the country. Her hat was wide-brimmed, her coat worn but clean, and her boots bore the marks of a long trail. Nobody knew her name at first. The town simply watched her ride down the dusty main road, the sun setting fire to her hair where it slipped loose from her hat. She didn't stop at the saloon, nor did she head toward the boarding house. Instead, she rode out past the old water tower and turned up toward a piece of land everyone thought was cursed, the Langley Ranch. The Langley place had been empty for near 6 years. The last owner, old Tom Langley, had died without kin, leaving behind miles of dry grass, a falling-down barn, and a reputation for bad luck. No one had dared touch it since. The well was said to have gone sour. The roof of the main house caved in during a storm, and coyotes made music there every night like they were singing for ghosts. So when the stranger dismounted at that gate and began working to lift it back on its hinges, people talked. By sundown, word had already reached the saloon. "She bought the Langley place," said the barkeep, polishing a glass with a rag. "Paid in full, cash," the men laughed. "A woman?" one said, shaking his head. "She won't last a week out there." "Maybe 2 if she's stubborn," another added, to the sound of spurs and chuckles. But there was something different about her. The next morning, she was already out mending fences with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. The townsfolk saw her hammering nails, moving lumber, driving a team of mules like she'd been born doing it. She didn't ask for help, didn't even seem to notice the stares. When she rode into town for supplies, her eyes were sharp but not unkind, like she could see through a man's bluster right down to his worry. At first, the women didn't know what to make of her. They whispered as she passed, hiding behind their baskets and aprons. Some said she must have been a widow running from something. Others claimed she was hiding a man in the hills somewhere, because surely no woman would take on a ranch by herself. Not out here. Then came the drought. It hit that summer without mercy. The grass turned brittle, the wells ran low, and the cattle began to die on the open range. Men rode into town with hollow eyes, selling off what little they had left. Many packed up altogether, heading north where the land still had color. Those who stayed looked to the church and the whiskey bottle for comfort. But up at the Langley Ranch, smoke still rose from the chimney every night. The woman worked alone, her silhouette visible against the dying light as she hauled water from the creek, repaired fence posts, and moved her herd uphill to better pasture. Some said she was blessed. Others said she was cursed. But everyone agreed she was stubborn beyond reason. One evening, as the sun melted down over the plains, a group of ranch wives gathered outside the general store. They talked about the drought, about how their husbands were losing hope, about how the land was turning against them, and somehow, the talk always circled back to her. "She makes the rest of us look weak," one said. "She's just waiting for some man to come along," another replied. "Mark my words, she'll end up needing help like the rest of us." But she didn't. Week after week, she rode into town with sacks of feed or lumber strapped to her wagon. She paid fair, spoke little, and tipped her hat politely. Once, a man offered to help her load supplies and she thanked him but finished the job herself. It wasn't pride. It was something quieter, something built from years of having to prove she could do what others said she couldn't. Then one night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind howled like an angry spirit, and rain hammered the roofs until they leaked. Lightning tore the sky open, striking the hills near the Langley Ranch. Folks could see the fire from town, orange and furious against the dark. A few of the men rode out at dawn to check the damage, expecting to find nothing but ashes. But when they reached the ridge, there she was. Soaked to the bone, her coat torn, she stood beside her barn with a shovel in her hands. The fire had eaten half the roof, but she'd stopped it from spreading to the corral. One of the men dismounted, shaking his head. "Ma'am, you should have sent for help. You could have been killed." She looked at him, rain dripping from her hat brim, and simply said, "Ain't the first storm I've had to ride through alone." After that day, something in the town began to shift. The women still whispered, but their voices carried less judgment and more wonder. Some started visiting her place quietly, asking about how she fixed her fences or how she kept her mules in line. She never lectured, just showed them. And soon enough, the laughter of women could be heard from that once cursed ranch. The men didn't know what to make of it. The idea of women working the land together made them uneasy, as if the ground itself were changing beneath their boots. The preacher warned them about pride, saying a home without a man was a house without a roof. But even his words sounded thin in the wind. By autumn, the Langley place had green grass again, and cattle grazed near the creek bed where the water had returned. Folks said it was a miracle. Others said it was the work of a woman who refused to believe what everyone else accepted as truth. But not everyone was pleased. There were those who saw her growing strength as a threat, men who'd once had the town's respect, now feeling their grip slipping. One night, a stranger rode into Silver Fern with questions about her, claiming to be from down south. He asked where she came from, whether she had any family left. No one knew what to tell him, and that's when the talk started again, low and uneasy, carried on the wind through the narrow streets, because whatever her past was, it was riding back toward her now, and this time, she might not be able to face it alone. The stranger came in just before dusk, when the town was settling into its quiet hour. He was a broad-shouldered man, his face half hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, and his coat carried the dust of a long road. His horse looked near spent, foam streaking its neck, but he didn't seem the type to rest easy. He tied the reins outside the saloon, stepped through the swinging doors, and ordered whiskey without a word. Folks turned to look because strangers were rare in Silver Fern, especially ones who came asking questions. He didn't say her name. Just asked about the woman up at the old Langley place. Said he'd heard a story of a rancher who'd taken over land thought to be cursed, who'd done it all without a man's help. His voice was calm, steady, but there was a sharpness beneath it, like a blade waiting to be drawn. The barkeep, a slow-talking man with eyes that missed nothing, polished a glass and said, "We mind our own business around here, mister. Folks who come looking for trouble usually find it." The stranger only smiled. "I ain't looking for trouble, just old debts." Word spread fast like it always did. By nightfall, every house in Silver Fern knew a man had come asking about her. Some said he was a lawman. Others whispered he was a bounty hunter. A few claimed he was her husband come to drag her back east. No one really knew, but by the way he moved, quiet, measured, and too sure of himself, they could tell he wasn't someone to cross. Up at the Langley Ranch, the woman felt the change before anyone said a word. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way the dogs wouldn't settle that night. The air carried a hum of unease, the kind that seeps under doors and keeps the lamps burning later than usual. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, staring toward the distant glow of town. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment, her eyes softened, like she was remembering something she wished she could forget. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting light on the worn wood of the cabin walls. Everything she had she'd built with her own hands. The shelves, the table, the small rocking chair by the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and that made it worth more than gold. On the mantel sat an old photograph, faded, edges curled from heat. A man stood beside her in it, smiling faintly, his hand resting on her shoulder. She stared at it for a long time before turning it face down. The next morning she rode into town like she always did. Calm, composed, no hint of worry. But the air felt different. People greeted her politely, but their eyes darted away too quickly. The storekeeper hesitated before weighing her flour. Even the preacher's wife, who usually found a reason to stop and talk, stayed quiet. She could feel it. Someone had stirred the dust and old ghosts were beginning to move again. The stranger was standing outside the general store when she stepped out, her supplies loaded in the wagon. Their eyes met for the first time. He removed his hat politely. Been a long time. She didn't answer right away. The weight of memory flickered behind her steady gaze. Finally, she said, "You should have stayed gone." "Couldn't," he replied simply. "You left too much behind." The people nearby pretended not to listen, but every ear caught the tension in their voices. She climbed onto her wagon without another word and steered her mule toward the road home. He didn't follow, not right away. He watched her go until the dust swallowed her from sight. Then he turned toward the saloon again. That evening, the saloon filled faster than usual. Men gathered in corners, trading theories like poker hands. Some said the stranger was after money. Others claimed there'd been blood between them once. The only thing everyone agreed on was that trouble was brewing. You could smell it, same way you could smell rain before it came. Back at the ranch, she worked until the last light faded. The wind was rising again, bringing the scent of rain and iron. She tied down the feed sacks, checked the horses, and lit the lanterns. Her mind kept drifting back to the man's face, to the sound of his voice. Rough, familiar, and dangerous in the way old memories often are. She'd built her peace on silence, and now silence was breaking apart one word at a time. Later that night, she sat by the fire with a journal open on her lap. The handwriting inside was neat, careful, every word placed with purpose. Pages of accounts, lists, and a few short notes written to herself. Reminders, not confessions. But the last page was blank. Her hand hovered above it for a long time before she finally wrote, "He's back." Then she shut the book tight and blew out the lamp. The next day, the stranger rode out toward her land. The sun was low, painting the hills in copper light. When he reached the gate, he stopped. The place was alive in a way that surprised him. Fields green again, fences mended, smoke rising steady from the chimney. It looked nothing like the wreck it had been when he last saw it. He dismounted slowly, almost hesitant, and leaned against the fence. She saw him before he could knock. "If you came here for forgiveness," she said, voice steady, "you won't find it." He took off his hat, eyes narrowing. "Didn't come for that. Came to tell you the past doesn't stay buried forever. Out here it does," she said, "if you know how to let it." He stepped closer, boots crunching on gravel. "You think this land forgets? You think the people who lost everything just disappear?" She looked at him long and hard. "We all lost something," she whispered. He didn't answer, just turned his gaze toward the horizon where the sun was bleeding into the sky. "They're coming, you know." "Not just me. There's men out there asking questions, hard ones, about where you got the money to buy this place, about what happened down south before you ran." Her jaw tightened. "Then they'll find what they always find, dust and rumor." But when he rode away, her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the fence post. The land had a way of holding secrets, but sometimes the wind unearthed them whether you wanted it or not. That night, a storm gathered again over Silver Fern. Lightning flickered on the far ridge, and the air felt charged with something heavier than rain. Down in town, the stranger sat alone at a poker table, a glass untouched in front of him. The barkeep watched him, then finally asked, "You sure you're doing right, stirring up what's been quiet this long?" The man didn't look up. "Quiet don't mean clean," he said. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, rattling the church sign and setting the saloon's lanterns flickering. The preacher prayed for peace that night, though he didn't know whose soul he was praying for. Up at the ranch, the woman stood at her window, staring into the dark. The storm broke open, rain hammering the roof, thunder rolling like hooves in the distance. She closed her eyes and listened. The sound of rain against the glass carried her back to another time, another ranch, another fire. A time when she wasn't alone. A time when trust had cost her everything. She didn't sleep, not even when the storm passed. At dawn, she saddled her horse and rode out before sunrise, heading toward the ridge beyond the creek. There, among the tall grass and mesquite, lay the remnants of an old cabin, burned down to its bones. She dismounted and walked slowly through the ashes. Buried beneath a layer of dirt and charred wood, she found what she was looking for, a rusted metal box, the kind soldiers used to carry. She brushed the dust off and opened it. Inside lay a few letters, yellowed and cracked, along with a silver badge and a single bullet casing. She stared at them for a long time, her breath catching in her throat. The sound of hooves broke the silence. She turned sharply, hand on the revolver at her hip. It wasn't the stranger. It was the preacher's wife, trembling and wide-eyed. "They're saying men are riding this way," she said, her voice breaking. "Armed men, 5 or 6. The stranger's gone. No one knows where, The woman didn't speak. She closed the box, tied it back under the saddle, and looked toward the horizon. The rising sun turned her face to gold, but her eyes were cold as iron. "Then it begins," she said quietly. And as the first glint of riders appeared far off across the plain, the land held its breath. The wind stilled, the creek hushed, and every soul in Silver Fern waited to see which would break first, the storm on the horizon, or the woman who'd built her world without a man to save her. The sun climbed higher that morning, but the light did little to soften the tension that hung over Silver Fern. The town felt uneasy, like a fiddle string pulled too tight. Even the usual sounds, the clank of the blacksmith's hammer, the low chatter outside the general store, seemed quieter than normal. Folks worked with one eye on the horizon, waiting for whatever was coming. Word had spread quick that riders were headed their way. No one knew who they were or what they wanted, but everyone knew it had something to do with the woman at the Langley Ranch. She had become more than just a rancher to the people of Silver Fern. She was a story, a whisper that carried through every porch and prayer. Some said she was a hero, others called her cursed. But that morning, when riders appeared in the distance like black flecks against the pale hills, everyone seemed to hold their breath for her. At the ranch, she was already ready. The horses were tied, the gates reinforced, and her rifle rested on the porch rail. The preacher's wife had begged her to come back to town, to take cover at the church, but she'd only shaken her head. "This land took everything from me once," she'd said. "It won't take it again." The riders drew closer, 6 of them, dust rising behind their horses like smoke. Their leader wore a long brown duster and carried himself with the heavy calm of a man who'd seen too many fights. He didn't ride fast, he didn't need to. Power has a way of moving slow, knowing it won't be denied. When they reached the fence line, they stopped. The leader looked over the property, taking in the barn, the creek, the woman standing firm on the porch. He tipped his hat in greeting, though the gesture held no kindness. "Fine piece of land you got here," he said. His voice carried easily on the wind. "Shame about who it used to belong to." "It belongs to no one but me now," she answered. He smiled faintly. "That so? Funny thing. Men down south are saying it was bought with stolen money, blood money. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" "I know what I earned," she said quietly. "And I know what was taken from me." Behind him, one of the men spat into the dirt. "You think we came all this way to listen to talk?" The leader held up a hand, silencing him. "Easy now. No need for rudeness. We just came to collect what's owed. You pay what you took and we'll be on our way. That's simple." Her grip tightened on the rifle. "And if I say there's nothing to pay?" His smile disappeared. "Then we'll take it ourselves." The wind shifted, and for a heartbeat the whole world seemed to pause. Then she raised the rifle, not to shoot but to make her point clear. "This land's seen enough thieves. You want something, you'll have to cross that fence." The man studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod to his men. They turned their horses and rode off toward the ridge, slow and deliberate. But it wasn't over. She knew that look. It was the look of men who left only to plan their return. That night the town buzzed with talk. Some wanted to ride out and help her. Others said it wasn't their fight. Fear has a way of making people forget courage. The preacher stood before the crowd in the saloon and said, "If we let the land be taken from one, it'll be taken from all." But his words didn't move them. No one wanted to face 6 armed men in the dark, except one. The stranger returned just after sunset, his horse lathered and eyes hard. He pushed through the saloon doors, found the preacher, and said, "Where is she?" "She's at the ranch," the preacher said. "Alone." The stranger cursed under his breath and left without another word. The townsfolk watched him go, too scared to follow, too ashamed to stop him. When he reached the Langley place, the lamps were still burning. She was sitting by the fire, rifle across her knees, calm as a lake before a storm. He stepped onto the porch and stopped a few feet away. "I told you to stay gone," she said without looking up. "Didn't listen then. Won't start now," she sighed. "You shouldn't have come back." "I heard what's coming," he said. 6 men, mean kind. You can't take them alone." "I've been alone a long time," she replied. "It's nothing new." He moved closer, voice low. "You think this is about the ranch?" "It's not. They're here because of what happened in Rio Verde. You know that." She looked up at him sharply. "I didn't start that fire." "I know," he said. "But they don't care. They need someone to blame, and you're the only one left to carry it." Silence stretched between them, heavy as the night itself. Finally she stood, setting the rifle aside. "Then we end it here. He nodded slowly. Then we ended. For the next hour they worked side by side, boarding windows, checking ammunition, and moving the livestock behind the barn. It was strange, the way they fell into rhythm without needing words, like two halves of a memory stitched back together. But beneath the surface ran a quiet current of guilt, regret, and something unspoken neither dared name. As the night deepened, he sat by the porch rail, watching the horizon. "You could have run," he said softly. "I did once," she answered. "Didn't fix anything." He stared into the dark. "You ever think about the ones we left behind?" Her voice trembled just slightly. "Every day." The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of horses in the distance. Both of them froze. She lifted her rifle again, scanning the ridge. Faint silhouettes appeared against the moonlit hills. "They're early," he murmured. She exhaled slowly. "Then so be it." The first shot cracked the air like lightning. It missed, striking the barn wall, but the warning was clear. More followed, sharp echoing across the open plain. The stranger ducked behind a trough, returning fire. The woman moved to the far end of the porch, eyes steady, shooting with the patience of someone who'd faced worse odds. The fight didn't last long. The riders pulled back after a few exchanges, vanishing into the dark. But she knew it wasn't over. They were testing her, learning the land, waiting for daylight. When silence finally fell again, she lowered her rifle and sat on the steps, breathing hard. The stranger joined her, his arm bleeding from a graze. "They'll be back," he said. "I know." He looked at her then, really looked at her. The set of her jaw, the tired strength in her eyes. "You never told them the truth, did you? About Rio Verde?" She shook her head. "Wouldn't matter. People believe what fits their story best. What's the truth then?" Her gaze drifted toward the firelight flickering through the window. "We were hired to guard that shipment, remember? The one they said was cattle money. But it wasn't. It was gold, stolen from the miners before the army could claim it. When the fighting broke out, they set the fire to cover their tracks. I tried to stop them. You know the rest." He nodded slowly, pain shadowing his face. "You ran. They said you shot a man to do it." Her eyes hardened. "I shot a man who deserved it." Neither spoke for a while after that. The night seemed to close around them, heavy with old sins. By dawn, the riders had regrouped. They waited just beyond the ridge, planning their next move. One of them, young, nervous, asked, "You sure she's worth all this trouble?" The leader's jaw tightened. "She took what wasn't hers. And if we don't finish this, word gets around that we're weak." In town, the preacher gathered a small group of men willing to help. Among them were ranchers, a blacksmith, and even the storekeeper who'd once refused to meet her eyes. They rode out quietly, praying they wouldn't arrive too late. Back at the ranch, the stranger stood ready by the barn while she reloaded inside. The morning light crept over the land, soft and golden, painting the fields with deceptive calm. He turned toward her and said, "When this is over, you could leave. Start fresh somewhere no one knows your name." She gave a faint smile. "And live pretending I'm someone else? No, this is where it ends." The sound of hooves began again, closer this time. The earth trembled under their rhythm. She looked out the window, heart steady. The stranger checked his revolver and met her gaze one last time. "Whatever happens," he said, "we stand together." The riders appeared at the edge of the property, sunlight glinting off their rifles. The leader raised his hand, signaling his men forward, and just as the first shot rang out, a second group of riders came over the ridge, the preacher and his men. Charging fast, the land erupted into chaos, the air thick with dust and gunfire. And through it all, she stood firm, the woman who'd built her life without a man to lean on, now forced to fight alongside one to keep it. But in her eyes burned something fierce and unyielding, a promise that no matter how this ended, the land would remember her name. And somewhere between the gunfire and the rising sun, the truth that had haunted Silver Fern was finally coming to light, though not everyone would live to see it. The air was thick with gun smoke and dust. The ground trembled beneath the pounding of hooves, and every shout, every gunshot echoed like thunder across the open land. The ranch that had once been silent and proud was now caught in the middle of chaos. The woman crouched low behind the corral fence, her rifle braced against the wood. Every breath came sharp and fast, her heart keeping time with the rhythm of gunfire. The preacher's men had reached the property just in time. Their arrival turned what would have been a quick ambush into a standoff. The attackers were better armed and more ruthless, but the ranch's defenders had something different on their side. Purpose, They were fighting not just for land, but for something larger, the right to stand free. The leader of the raiders, still calm despite the heat of battle, barked orders from behind his horse. He wasn't the kind to waste bullets. His men fired in measured bursts, keeping pressure on the defenders. He was waiting for something, an opening, a mistake. The woman reloaded, fingers moving steady despite the tremor in her arms. The stranger crouched beside her, sweat streaking through the dust on his face. "We can't hold them here," he said, scanning the ridge. "They'll flank us from the west once the sun's high enough," she nodded. "Then we make them think we're stronger than we are." He raised an eyebrow. "You got a plan?" "Not much of one," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But it's all we've got." They split the few defenders into pairs, moving them across the yard in short bursts. Each time one group fired, the others went quiet, making it sound like there were more guns than there really were. The trick worked for a while. The attackers hesitated, unsure how many they were facing. But the leader wasn't fooled for long. He dismounted, walking through the smoke like a man out for a stroll, and shouted, "You think hiding behind a fence is gonna save you? We know who you are, girl. We know what you did in Rio Verde." The woman froze for half a heartbeat, the name slicing through her like a knife. Then she steadied her aim and fired. The bullet struck the post beside him, close enough to splinter wood. The stranger gave her a quick glance. "You can't let him rattle you." "He's not rattling me," she said, though her voice carried more steel than calm. From behind the barn, one of the younger defenders, a boy barely 20, cried out. A shot had caught his shoulder. The preacher rushed to pull him back, muttering prayers under his breath as he worked to stop the bleeding. The smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat and blood. The sound of horses screaming in fear filled the air. The woman's mind raced. The attackers weren't backing down. If anything, they were growing more aggressive. They wanted her alive, that much was clear. The leader's taunts weren't meant to kill her, they were meant to draw her out. The stranger moved closer. "We've got one chance," he said quietly. "If we can get to the barn, we can push them toward the creek bed. There's cover there." She looked toward the barn, half in ruins from the earlier gunfire. "It's open ground," she said. "Yeah," he replied. "That's what makes it crazy enough to work." Before she could argue, he dashed forward, firing as he ran. She cursed under her breath and followed, bullets cutting the air around them. They made it to the barn, ducking behind the doorway just as another round of shots hit the wall. The sound was deafening. Inside it was dark and hot, the smell of hay and smoke heavy in the air. She pressed her back against a beam, breathing hard. "You always had a bad sense of timing," she muttered. He managed a small grin. "You always did like to follow trouble." Their moment of calm didn't last. The attackers were closing in, moving in a half circle. She could hear their boots crunching on the gravel outside. The preacher and the others were still holding the front line, but the defenders were spread thin. One of the attackers threw a lantern through the barn door. It shattered against the floor and the hay burst into flame. The fire caught fast, licking up the walls, filling the air with choking smoke. The stranger grabbed her arm. "We have to move." They ran out the side door just as the flames roared higher. Behind them, the barn began to collapse in on itself. The smoke billowed upward, turning the sky dark. It was chaos now. No more tactics, no more tricks. Just survival. From her vantage point on the porch earlier that morning, the woman had thought she knew what fear was. She'd been wrong. Fear wasn't silence, it was noise, the kind that filled your head until you couldn't think straight. She could hear gunfire from every direction, men shouting, horses breaking loose. The once quiet land she'd worked so hard to tame was now a battlefield. The preacher's voice cut through the noise, shouting, "Hold the line! Don't let them through!" His faith was fierce, but even faith had its limits. The stranger pulled her behind a fallen beam. "We can't win this by holding ground," he said. "We need to make them run." "And how do we do that?" she asked. He looked toward the water tower at the edge of the property. The old structure leaned slightly but still held a full tank. "If we can break that, the flood'll wash through the creek bed, catch them off guard." Her eyes widened. "You'll drown half the herd. They'll die anyway if this land's taken," he said. Without waiting for an answer, he sprinted toward the tower. She covered him, firing until the last bullet was gone. Then she grabbed another cartridge from her belt, loading fast. The attackers had noticed him now. A few broke off, galloping toward the tower to cut him off. He climbed halfway up the ladder when a bullet grazed his leg. He stumbled but didn't stop. Reaching the top, he pulled the lever, forcing it open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the old wood gave way, and the water burst out in a violent rush. It tore through the dry ground, sweeping down toward the creek like a storm. The riders never saw it coming. Horses reared, men shouted, and the flood carried mud, debris, and fire with it. The sudden chaos broke their formation. The woman watched from below, half in disbelief. The plan had worked, but at a cost. The tower groaned under the pressure, its frame cracking. "Get down!" she yelled, but her voice was lost in the roar. The tower collapsed, slamming into the ground with a sound like thunder. The stranger disappeared in the crash. For a second, she couldn't move. The world blurred around her, the water rushing, smoke rising, men shouting in panic. Then she ran. The attackers were scattering now, some retreating down the flooded creek, others trying to circle back, but she didn't care about them. When she reached the wreckage, she found him pinned under a beam, blood streaking his arm and side. He was alive, but barely. She pulled at the wood, straining until her muscles screamed. Finally, it gave way enough for him to crawl free. "You're a damn fool," she said, her voice breaking. He coughed, half a smile on his lips. "You say that like it's new." Before she could answer, another shot rang out, closer this time. The leader of the raiders stood a few yards away, drenched and furious, his gun leveled. "You think you can ruin me and walk away?" he shouted. "You don't know what you've started." The woman raised her rifle, but it was empty. She froze. The stranger tried to reach for his revolver, but the leader's gun clicked first. "You should have stayed buried," the man said coldly. The preacher's voice rang out behind him. "Put it down!" The leader spun just as the preacher fired. The shot hit his shoulder, spinning him backward. He fell into the mud, gun slipping from his grasp. For a heartbeat, the world went silent again. The sound of the flood fading, the smoke thinning, the last echo of gunfire drifting off into the distance. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The raiders were regrouping farther down the hill. She could see them through the haze. 4 of them still mounted, circling, angry, desperate. They weren't retreating. They were preparing for one final charge. The stranger struggled to stand. "They'll come again," he said hoarsely. She looked toward the broken tower, the burning barn, the wounded men around her. "Then we finish it," she whispered. The preacher met her eyes, weary but resolute. "You can't win alone," he said. She glanced at the stranger beside her, then back at the horizon where the raiders gathered like vultures. "I'm not alone anymore." The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of horses moving fast. She gripped her rifle tighter, heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the final reckoning. Everything she'd fought for, everything she'd lost, was leading to this moment. And as the raiders crested the ridge for their last assault, the woman took her position at the fence, the same place where it had all begun. The light of dawn broke across the valley, painting her face in gold and shadow. The land was ready to take back its due, and so was she. The raiders thundered down the ridge, their shouts cutting through the morning air. The ground trembled beneath the weight of their charge, hooves throwing up dust and mud. The woman stood her ground at the fence, the stranger beside her, both battered but unbroken. The preacher knelt a few yards away, tending to the wounded, but his eyes were locked on the horizon. Everyone could feel it. This was the end. The woman raised her rifle, calm settling over her like the still before a storm. The stranger reloaded beside her, his leg bleeding, his face pale, but his hand steady. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said in the silence between gunfire. When the raiders drew close enough to see their faces, she pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the valley, hitting the first rider square in the chest. The others wavered for a moment, then pressed harder, screaming in rage. The stranger fired next, dropping another horse. The animal's fall sent 2 men tumbling into the dirt. The remaining riders tried to circle, but the flood had turned the ground soft. Their horses slipped, their formation broke, and the defenders seized their moment. The preacher, though unarmed, stood and raised his voice, a cry that cut through the chaos. "Enough!" he shouted. "Lay down your hate before the earth takes you with it." The leader of the raiders, wounded but still burning with fury, raised his gun. His voice was raw. "This land ain't yours to keep," he spat. The woman stepped forward, eyes steady. "It was never yours to take," he fired. The bullet tore through her sleeve, grazing her arm, but she didn't flinch. Her rifle answered, the sound echoing across the empty field. His weapon fell from his hand. For a long moment he just stared at her, shock and disbelief on his face. Then slowly he sank to his knees. The battle was over. The sound of hooves faded into the distance as the last of the raiders fled, leaving their leader lying still in the mud. The woman lowered her rifle, her hands shaking only after the silence returned. The preacher crossed himself softly, then moved to help the wounded. Smoke drifted from the ruins of the barn. The air smelled of ash, gunpowder, and wet earth. The stranger limped toward her, his face a mix of exhaustion and relief. "It's done," he said quietly. She nodded, eyes still fixed on the horizon. For now. They stood there together side by side as the sun climbed higher. The land that had seen so much blood was quiet again. The wind brushed across the broken fence, the scorched fields, the scattered shells. Life, fragile as it was, had a way of coming back. Over the next few days, they buried the dead. The preacher read simple words over each grave, no long sermons, no fancy talk, just peace for the souls who'd fought and fallen. The woman helped dig, even when her arm ached. She owed that much to them. The stranger stayed close, his leg wrapped in bandages. Every night, as the stars rose over the valley, they sat by the fire without saying much. Silence had become their comfort. One night, after the work was done and the flames burned low, the preacher sat across from them. "You both could leave," he said. "Start new someplace where no one knows your names." The woman looked into the fire. "I've run before," she said. "Didn't fix anything." The preacher nodded slowly. "Then maybe staying's the only way to fix it." She turned to the stranger. "You leaving?" He poked at the fire with a stick, thoughtful. "I came here looking for peace," he said. "Didn't think I'd find it in a fight." She smiled faintly. "Funny how that works," he met her eyes. "If you'll have me, I'll stay. I've built fences before. Can rebuild this one." Something softened in her expression. "Then we'll start tomorrow." And they did. In the weeks that followed, the ranch slowly came back to life. The surviving cattle were gathered, the fence mended one post at a time. The preacher helped where he could, often singing old hymns as he worked, his voice rough but steady. The land bore its scars, charred wood, broken earth, but beneath it, green shoots began to rise. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began to appear again. They brought tools, seed, and food. Some came out of guilt for not standing with her before. Others came because they'd heard what happened and couldn't believe it. The woman welcomed them all. The stranger took over much of the heavy work, though his legs still slowed him down. He never complained. The woman often caught him watching the hills, as if expecting trouble to return, but it never did. The raiders had been broken, their leader's death scattering the rest for good. One morning, as the first light touched the valley, the woman stood on the porch looking out over the fields. The land was quiet again, different now, but alive. The stranger stepped beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You thinking about leaving again?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "No, just thinking how strange it feels." "Peace," he smiled. "You earned it." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "We earned it." Down by the creek, the preacher was mending a fence rail, humming as he worked. A few children from a nearby homestead were playing in the grass, their laughter bright in the morning air. For the first time in a long while, the land felt like it belonged to everyone again. As the day went on, she walked through the fields, touching the new shoots of wheat that had survived the flood. The smell of earth and sun mixed together, honest, real, alive. Every mark of destruction had become a reminder of what they'd fought for. That evening, the preacher led a small gathering by the water. No sermon, just words of gratitude. The sun dipped low, turning the sky gold and red. The woman listened quietly, her heart calm. The stranger stood beside her, his hand brushing hers just once, enough to say what words didn't need to. When the prayer ended, the preacher smiled at her. "You did right," he said. "You kept this place alive," she shook her head. "This place kept me alive." He nodded, knowing she meant more than the land. As night settled over the valley, she sat again on the porch, the same spot where everything had begun. The stars stretched wide above, and the wind carried only the soft sounds of life. Crickets, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves. For the first time, she felt no need to look over her shoulder. The stranger joined her, leaning on the railing. "You ever wonder if all this will hold?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Things fall apart. Then you build again. That's all life is, I guess," he nodded. "Then I guess we'll keep building." They stayed like that for a long time, watching the horizon fade into night. The land, though scarred, was steady. The ranch, once nearly lost, stood whole again. Not just because of fences or walls, but because of the people who refused to give up on it. And somewhere in that quiet, The past finally let go. The ghosts of old fights, old names, and old wounds drifted away with the wind. By spring, grass had covered the burnt patches, and wildflowers grew where bullets once fell. Travelers passing through would sometimes stop by the ranch, asking about the story they'd heard, about the woman who stood her ground and the man who helped her hold it. She never told the tale the same way twice. Some parts were best left to the land to remember, but when asked what she learned from it all, she'd simply say, "You don't measure strength by how hard you fight. You measure it by how much you stay standing after the fight's done." And as the sun rose over the valley each morning, painting the ranch in soft gold, it seemed to whisper that same truth. The land remembers, but it also forgives. Life went on quietly and honestly, the way it always had before the storms came. The woman, the stranger, and the preacher built their days from small things, mending fences, planting seed, sharing bread. No longer haunted by what had been, but grateful for what was left. In the end, peace didn't come from winning. It came from staying, from choosing to build where the ground was broken, from finding home, not in what you own, but in who stands beside you when the dust settles. And so the ranch stood, firm and quiet under the wide American sky, its fences strong, its people stronger still. The land had seen blood, sorrow, and courage, but it had also seen forgiveness, and that more than anything was what made it whole again.